Okay, so good morning, everybody. Today we're going to be discussing medical records when filing for Social Security disability. So if you're watching the video on my website, you're likely either have already filed or you're intending to file, and you're just looking for some information right now to how to go about the process. Well, one of the things I think you ought to do is step back and evaluate your medical condition. It could save you a lot of time and potentially could help you win the case before having to go to a hearing, or even win the case at the hearing and not being denied. Because let me put it to you this way: the average approval rate of administrative law judges that hear cases on hearings is anywhere from about 40 to 49%. Now, that amount increases when people have attorneys. It tends to, especially an experienced Social Security disability attorney, those approval rates actually go up. But taken as a whole, the average rate in the United States for all ALJs across the country on Social Security disability claims at the hearing level falls somewhere in the 40% range. And so you have approximately a high 50% chance against you going into a hearing, especially if you're alone and you don't have representation, that you're going to be denied. And most of the time, it's just people don't understand the process. Here's the other thing that is very difficult for people. Okay, so they don't really understand what records Social Security has and what records are missing. So after the hearing, the judge is likely to, if the judge mentions it to you and says, hey, you're wanting me to rule on this case and I don't have records from you for the last 9 months. The judge is going to hold the case open for about 20 days or maybe up to 30 days if you're not represented, and let you get the medical information into him or her and then still make a decision. But the problem with it is that there may be other medical evidence missing out there that shows a continuing pattern of disability that the judge can evaluate. But where does medical evidence really come in? Okay, so that's at the hearing level. But where does medical evidence come in that makes it so important, especially from starting the beginning of the case, from the very beginning? All right, so what you have to understand is there's relevant medical evidence and there's medical evidence that Social Security considers not relevant. When I do claims with people often want to go back 10 years even on their medical evidence, and it may be that, like, for example, a woman is filing for a back injury, but she wants to include her OBGYN records. Okay, so you need to understand, you need to carve out the records that are not pertinent to the case and don't help it. They just muddy the waters, number one. And Social Security won't look at them. So in going back to records that are, say, 10 years old, there's a problem there. Social Security and the judges really want to look for medical records on 2 years, look at medical records from 2 years before the onset date, and that goes all the way through the decision-making process, So let's say, for example, you file for disability this month, September of 2016. You allege an onset date. Now, your onset date is the date that it establishes a couple of things. First and foremost, it establishes the date that you're stating you became disabled. But there's some other parameters on the onset date you have to be aware of. Okay, first and foremost, did you stop working on that onset date? So, if you continued to work, if you were making above substantial gainful activity limits over, say, $1,130 a month, then you can't establish that's your onset date. So you got to remember that. And also, too, you can only establish your onset date when you can show by your medical records that you were disabled at the time. So simply just picking a number out of the air because it sounds good, or you started feeling really bad then, but you didn't go to the doctor until 3 months later, you really can't establish an onset date. But so be careful when choosing your onset date. Another thing too, guys, is if you have work credit issues, so you're filing for SSDI, but you've been working sporadically over the last 10 years, or you haven't worked, say, for the last 4 years, and you're getting dangerously close to not being insured anymore through the Social Security Administration for disability benefits, or you haven't worked in the last 5 years, for example, and then you've got to establish that you were actually disabled before your insurance benefits expired. And I'm not talking about your personal insurance, health insurance. What I'm talking about is that you're paying into the disability system through your FICA taxes, and you're earning work credits that go towards your retirement, towards disability, etc. But disability doesn't last forever. So if you haven't worked at least 5 out of the last 10 years, you could be running the risk of having to establish an onset date before the time you became disabled. And let me tell you something. If you have any inclination or any hesitation is the word I'm looking for. If you have any hesitation and you fit this profile, go to your local Social Security office, ask them for a work history report showing your quarters of earned work credits, and sit down with an attorney, a disability attorney, let him count back under the last 10 years, making sure that you have 20 work credits out of the last 10 years. It gets complicated. That's not the point of this talk, but suffice it to say that then you can pick an onset date in which you were disabled, and then you just have to find your medical records to show that they support it, okay? So getting back to our example here. It's September of 2016, and you're going to try to establish an onset date of January of 2014. You state that in September of 2016, you've already been disabled 2 years, and January of 2014 is your disability date. Okay. Now, when you file for disability and you list where your medical records are by when you started going to your physician, the last time you went to see your physician, and any upcoming future date, you're telling Social Security that I have medical records within this date to this date, and so that when they pull your records, they'll ask the doctor or the hospital, we only need records from this date to this date, and that's all they're going to look at. Okay, so you file for say January 2014. Okay, you can allege your medical records all the way back to January 2012. 2 years on, they say either side of the onset date. Well, if it goes to a hearing, you're typically looking at 2 years anyway. So from January, 2 years before your onset date, and 2016, September of 2016, let's say you have a hearing. Those medical records are relevant. Anything beyond that amount, anything beyond that time is not going to be considered relevant. And for the most part, Social Security is going to ignore, say, December of 2011, if you're alleging that onset date, January 2014. Okay, so those fall outside the range. And why is that? Well, you can't ask the administration to go back and look at medical records since the age you were 5, especially for mental issues, because it's just not efficient, and the disability system struggles to be efficient as is. So you can, especially if you were working, you can't allege onset dates or your medical records to show you were disabled 10 years ago, but you were working full time. And again, so that also helps make sense, is when we talked about the 5 steps to being determined disabled. Step one goes back to you're not currently involved in SGA, engaging in SGA, substantial gainful activity. And so alleging medical records from 10 years before while you're working full time, it's not gonna go. All right, last but not least, why are your medical records so important? Well, number one, Social Security even states that it cannot, even if you allege how severe your conditions are, if you cannot back them up with objective medical evidence, then Social Security states they cannot approve your claim. So that's why it's so important to have good medical records. Also, too, if you have no place to live, if you're living in a shelter, for example, things like that, go to county at least once every 3 months and have them do an assessment of your condition. That shows that you're wanting to continue treatment. Social Security does not want to give out a check to somebody that is not interested in bettering their condition and getting back off disability and then being a contributing member to society, a working member. So that's one of the reasons why your medical evidence is so incredibly important. And again, a consistent pattern of alleging a condition, going to the doctor and seeing these dates over and over again for, say, a solid 2-year period where you're going to the doctor, you're seeking treatment, and the doctor is noting what kind of restrictions your condition is having on you. You can't get any better than that, to be real honest with you. And if you can do that, and if you have to go to a hearing, if your testimony lines up with what your medical records have to say, and you come off as an honest and credible person, there's a good likelihood that you could increase those odds from 40% to even 60 or 70%, especially for my claimants that are over the age of 50. So I can't stress enough how important medical evidence is, medical records, consistent medical records. And I understand that it is often extremely difficult to be able to get medical assistance, especially in the United States, where medical care is done at a profit. But every single one of my clients finds a way to at least go through the county emergency room or find some type of indigent care at least once every 3 or 4 months to show they still have this ongoing condition. And more times than not, we end up having a successful claim. See you guys tomorrow.